The forest was so still it felt like it was holding its breath. Somewhere beyond the trees, the lake whispered against its banks, the sound barely reaching the old wooden cabin crouched in the clearing. Inside, a single light flickered against the walls, casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to move on their own. He had come here for silence, to escape the noise of the city and the noise inside his head, but silence can play tricks on you. It can stretch moments until they feel endless. It can make you hear things that aren't there, or maybe notice things that are. That night, it wasn't the wind that stirred the air. It wasn't the creak of the cabin settling. It was footsteps. Slow. Measured. Coming closer. A knock followed, 3 quiet taps against the door. And when he opened it, the face staring back at him was both a stranger's and something far more familiar, as if the night itself had carried a piece of his past to his doorstep. The drive into the woods had felt endless, the narrow road curling like a ribbon through towering pines that seemed to lean in toward the car, swallowing what little light remained of the day. He had been chasing the idea of silence all week, counting the hours until he could leave the city behind and retreat into a place where time moved differently. The noise of his apartment building, the constant buzz of his phone, the faint hum of traffic even in the middle of the night, it had all become too much. The cabin had been in his family for years, though he hadn't visited in a long time. It sat far from the nearest town, hidden in a clearing only locals knew about, the kind of place where the world couldn't easily reach you. By the time he pulled up the gravel path, night had fully settled over the forest. The headlights swept across the cabin's weathered wooden walls, the slanted roof glistening from a light rain that must have fallen earlier. He turned off the engine, and the sudden absence of sound was almost dizzying. He stepped out of the car, feeling the cool air wrap around him, carrying the smell of wet earth and pine. For a moment, he stood there breathing it in, letting the tension in his shoulders ease just a little. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of old wood and pine sap. He flicked on the light, though it was dim, more golden glow than brightness. Everything was just as he remembered, the small stone fireplace against the far wall, the old wooden table with 2 mismatched chairs, the narrow hallway that led to the bedroom. It was simple, almost bare, but it felt like it belonged to another world entirely. He unpacked a few things from his bag, lit a fire, and made himself a mug of tea, the steam curling into the cool air. Settling into the armchair by the fireplace, he let the quiet wrap around him like a blanket. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, and the crackle of the fire was the only thing keeping the night from being completely still. Then, faintly at first, he heard it, footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, coming from the direction of the porch. His grip tightened on the mug, his pulse quickening. This wasn't the sound of branches falling or the restless movement of an animal. It was too precise. Too human. He set the mug down and moved quietly toward the door, his bare feet silent against the worn wooden floorboards. The knock that came next was soft, almost cautious, 3 gentle taps that seemed designed not to disturb anyone else, as if there might be someone else listening in the darkness. He hesitated, a part of him screaming to stay still, to ignore it, to pretend he wasn't here. But the quiet between each knock pressed in on him until he reached for the handle and opened the door just enough to see. A man stood there, drenched from head to toe, rainwater dripping from his dark hair and running down the side of his face. His clothes clung to him, and the straps of his worn backpack were slick with moisture. His eyes met his immediately, steady, unflinching, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. There was something about his face, something that stirred a strange, almost uncomfortable familiarity, though he couldn't place it. "I'm sorry," the man said finally, his voice low and edged with exhaustion. "I didn't mean to bother you. I was hiking, and I got caught in the rain. I lost my way. Would it be all right if I stayed here tonight? Just until morning." His words carried an odd mix of humility and certainty, as though he already knew the answer. The rain outside had started again, pattering hard against the porch roof. He thought about telling him there was a small town 20 miles back, about giving directions, but in weather like this, sending him away felt impossible. He opened the door wider, stepping aside. The man's eyes lingered on his for a heartbeat before he stepped in. Inside, the warmth from the fire seemed to loosen something in him, and he let out a quiet sigh. "Thank you," he murmured, though he kept his backpack on, almost as if he wasn't sure he'd be staying. He gestured toward one of the chairs, and the man sat, holding his hands out slightly toward the fire as though trying to absorb its heat. A fresh mug of tea was placed in front of him, and they began to talk, though the words were awkward at first. He asked where the man had been hiking, how long he'd been out there. The answers were short, careful, and his gaze held a depth that made it seem like there was more he wasn't saying. In the flicker of firelight, small details became sharper, the faint scar that traced along his jaw, the way his lips pressed together for a moment before he spoke, the subtle flicker in his eyes when certain questions were asked. It was during one of those silences that a flash of memory broke through, the noise of a crowded street, a blur of rainbow flags, the echo of voices shouting in unison, and for the briefest second, the feel of someone's shoulder brushing against his in the chaos. It was gone almost instantly, leaving behind a strange ache in his chest. The rain outside grew heavier, drumming against the cabin roof. The stranger's eyes met his again, and neither of them looked away this time. The silence that followed didn't feel empty, it felt like the air itself was waiting for something to happen. The fire burned steady now, its glow painting their faces in warm light while outside the storm raged harder, the wind pressing against the cabin walls like something alive and impatient. He could hear the rain striking the tin edge of the porch roof in a relentless rhythm, a sound that should have been soothing but instead seemed to heighten the tension in the small space. The stranger sat with his hands cupped around the mug, steam curling up to touch his face, his eyes fixed on the flames as if searching for something in them. Conversation had begun to flow more easily since he'd come inside, but there was still a hesitance in his words, a quiet calculation as if each answer was weighed before being spoken. He learned that the man's name was Daniel, though when he said it, it came out almost reluctantly, like it wasn't a name he'd given in a long time. Daniel said he'd been hiking for days, following trails that didn't always stay where the maps promised they would. He said the rain had started earlier in the afternoon and never let up, turning the ground into slick mud and making his compass useless. He didn't explain why he'd been out here alone, or what destination he'd had in mind, and though the questions lingered in the air, the host didn't push them just yet. Instead, he poured more tea, sliding the mug across the table until Daniel's fingers brushed against his in a fleeting touch. That small contact sparked something electric, unexpected, almost jarring, making him withdraw his hand quickly, pretending it hadn't happened. Daniel's gaze flicked up briefly, as though he'd noticed, then returned to the fire. The conversation shifted to safer topics, the way the forest looked in autumn, the stubbornness of the old chimney, the kind of storms that sometimes rolled in from the north and stayed for days. But there was an undercurrent, a subtle awareness in the way they spoke, as if both knew they were circling something much deeper without daring to dive into it yet. In the soft glow of the firelight, Daniel's face seemed almost otherworldly, shadows emphasizing the strong lines of his jaw, the tired set of his mouth, the faint creases at the corners of his eyes. He looked older than the man from that half-memory the host couldn't quite piece together, but something about the way he held himself, the stillness, the quiet strength, felt the same. At one point, the wind outside hit the cabin with such force that the walls gave a low groan, and for a second Daniel's eyes left the fire to search the dark windows. The host found himself studying him, wondering not just who he was now, but who he had been before arriving here. There was a fragility in his posture that didn't match the image of a seasoned hiker lost in the woods. It was as if he carried the weight of something unspoken, something that clung to him even in the warmth of the fire. Minutes stretched into hours without either of them noticing, the storm outside erasing any thought of time. At one point, the host told a story from his childhood about spending summers here at the cabin with his uncle, learning to fish in the lake and being warned never to wander into the forest after dark. Daniel listened closely, his expression softening at the mention of those quiet days long gone. He responded with a few stories of his own, about a city he once lived in, about a night he'd stood in a crowded street watching strangers lock arms and sing even as police lined the sidewalks, about the strange comfort that comes from being surrounded by people who understand your existence without needing it explained. There was a tone in his voice when he spoke about that night, low and reverent, like it was something sacred. The host felt the echo of his own memories stirring again, the smell of rain on asphalt, the heat of bodies pressed close together in defiance, the colors of flags whipping in the wind under streetlights. But before he could chase the thought further, Daniel's words slowed, his gaze lowering, and the moment passed. The rain began to beat harder against the roof, each drop sounding sharper now, like tiny knocks trying to pull their attention away from each other. The fire hissed softly as a log shifted and released a burst of sparks. The host leaned back, realizing he'd been sitting forward this whole time, drawn in by the stranger's presence without meaning to be. There was something magnetic about the space between their words, the way silence didn't feel empty but instead seemed to thicken the air between them. At one point, Daniel smiled faintly at something the host had said, and for just an instant, that smile reached his eyes, stripping away the guarded layer he'd worn since stepping inside. It was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by the same thoughtful stillness. The host wanted to ask him outright, if they had met before, if the memory that kept brushing against his mind belonged to both of them, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he offered more tea, letting the question hang unspoken. Outside, the storm showed no sign of ending, and somewhere deep in the forest, a branch snapped with a sound that carried across the clearing. Neither of them moved. Neither of them seemed willing to break the fragile thread that had begun weaving itself between them. The hours had begun to blend together, the storm outside turning the cabin into an island in the middle of a restless sea of trees. The fire's glow painted the room in shades of amber and gold, shadows shifting lazily across the walls as if they too were listening in on every word exchanged. Their conversation no longer needed prompting. It moved with a strange, careful rhythm, like two people learning the steps of a dance they hadn't realized they'd agreed to. Sometimes the talk was light, small details about music they liked, food they missed from childhood, but just as often it wandered into territory that felt far more dangerous, pulling threads from memories neither had meant to touch. Daniel spoke of a city far from here, a place where the nights were alive with music and the streets were filled with voices demanding to be heard. He talked about protests, about faces blurred in the heat of the crowd, about holding someone's hand just tight enough to say "I'm here" without having to speak it aloud. The way he told it, you could almost feel the press of bodies, the sting of tear gas in the air, the vibration of feet pounding against pavement. The host found himself leaning in, caught not just in the story but in the way Daniel's voice seemed to change when he spoke about those moments, low, almost reverent, like recalling something half sacred and half haunting. At one point, Daniel's eyes flickered to his, and in that look there was something unguarded, almost like recognition, but it passed too quickly to name. The host felt the shape of a question forming on his lips, had they been in the same place once, at the same time, but swallowed it, afraid of what asking might break. Instead, he offered his own story, halting at first, about a boy he'd loved once when he was young, They'd been careful then, speaking in codes and meeting in places no one would think to look, but caution hadn't saved them from being found out. His voice tightened when he spoke of it, the memory of that betrayal still lodged deep, the boy's absence still sharp after all these years. Daniel didn't interrupt. He didn't even move, except to rest his forearms on the table and listen in a way that made it feel like the room itself was holding its breath. The host didn't often speak of those years, too much of it belonged to a part of himself he had learned to keep locked away, but the quiet in Daniel's eyes made it easier somehow. It was as if Daniel understood without needing the whole explanation, as if he'd carried his own ghosts for just as long. Outside, the wind surged again, rattling the windows so hard that for a moment it seemed the glass might give. The fire hissed as if startled, sending a few sparks leaping into the air before dying in the ash. Their words fell away, replaced by a silence that wasn't awkward but heavy, charged. The host realized his hands were resting on the table between them, and when Daniel's fingers moved, they came close, so close they almost touched. The space between them felt alive, as if the smallest motion would close it completely. He wanted to move, to feel the warmth of skin against skin, but the fear of what might happen next rooted him in place. Daniel's gaze dropped to that almost touch, then rose again slowly, locking eyes in a way that made the rest of the cabin disappear. For a heartbeat, it seemed certain something would happen, some shift, some breaking open, but then Daniel pulled his hands back, curling them around his mug again as though retreating behind its safety. The host tried to hide his disappointment, staring at the fire instead. The rain's rhythm changed, slower now, but still steady enough to remind them they were sealed away from the outside world. Time felt strange, elastic, stretching and contracting in ways that made it impossible to know if they'd been sitting like this for minutes or hours. They spoke again eventually, though softer this time, each word carrying more weight than the last. Daniel asked questions he hadn't expected, about why he'd come here alone, about what he was running from. The host wanted to say it wasn't running, that it was simply needing air, but the truth was harder than that. He had been trying to quiet something inside himself that wouldn't stop speaking, an old ache that nights like this seemed to make louder. Daniel didn't press when he didn't answer right away. He just nodded, as if the silence itself was an answer he understood. And in that stillness, the host began to feel something dangerous, the sense that maybe Daniel wasn't just a stranger passing through, but someone he'd been moving toward for a very long time without knowing it. The night seemed to draw itself tighter around the cabin, the storm pressing in on every side until it felt like the walls themselves were bracing against it. The fire had burned low, its glow flickering weakly against the corners of the room, and when the first power surge came, it was so quick it barely registered, a soft blink of the lamp before the light returned. But the second time, the flicker stretched longer, the shadows shifting unnaturally across the walls, and by the third, the entire cabin fell into darkness. For a moment, the only light came from the faint embers in the fireplace, painting the room in deep red and orange, the air heavy with the smell of wood smoke. Daniel moved first, his voice low but steady as he suggested candles. The host found them in a small drawer by the kitchen sink, their wax surfaces cool and dusty to the touch. Soon, the room was dotted with small flames, each one casting its own trembling halo of light. The world beyond the windows vanished completely, replaced by the reflection of their faces in the glass. There was a kind of intimacy to it, sitting there surrounded by shadows, the storm outside invisible but audible, a constant reminder that they were utterly alone. The candles made everything feel closer, more immediate. Even the sound of Daniel's breathing seemed louder in the quiet. They sat again by the fire, now little more than glowing coals, and for a while neither spoke. It wasn't the silence of strangers, but the silence of something unspoken building between them. When Daniel finally broke it, his voice carried the weight of something personal, something not meant for casual conversation. He asked about the cabin, how long it had been in the family, how often the host came here, and though the questions seemed harmless, they were laced with a deeper curiosity, as though he wasn't just asking about the building, but about the life lived around it. The host answered slowly, his words deliberate, his mind half on the memories the place held. Then, almost without realizing he was speaking it aloud, he told Daniel about the first man he had ever loved. He described how they'd met, the way it had felt like sunlight breaking through after years of shadow, and how quickly that light had been taken away. He spoke of the fear they'd lived under, the careful steps, the coded glances, the unspoken rules about who could know and who could never be told. And then, in a voice barely more than a whisper, he told Daniel about the night it all ended, how a single act of cruelty from someone they thought they could trust had exposed them, how the aftermath had been swift and brutal, how he had stood at a graveside not long after, wondering if love had been worth the risk. Daniel didn't interrupt. He didn't fidget or glance away. He just sat there, eyes locked on him, the candlelight catching in their depths in a way that made it hard to tell if it was reflection or something else. When the host fell silent, the room felt heavier, as though the story had drawn something out of him that could never be put back. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his expression soft but unreadable. Then he said, almost quietly enough to be mistaken for the wind, "I'm sorry you had to carry that alone." The words landed with a kind of quiet force, making the host's chest tighten. It had been a long time since anyone had said something like that to him, with no pity in their tone, just understanding. They stayed like that for a long moment, the storm's voice filling the spaces their own couldn't. Somewhere in the darkness outside, a tree branch cracked and fell, the sound carrying through the clearing like a warning or a release. Daniel's gaze never wavered, and for the first time in years, the host felt like he was being seen in his entirety, not just the parts he showed to the world, but the parts he had kept hidden even from himself. And under the low hum of the storm, in the flicker of the candlelight, that feeling was as terrifying as it was impossible to turn away from. The candles had burned lower, their wax pooling at the bases, the flames shrinking but holding steady against the drafts that occasionally slipped through the old cabin walls. The storm outside had shifted into something quieter now, not the violent, battering force it had been earlier but a softer, relentless rain that whispered against the roof and windows. The room felt different, as though the air between them had thickened with the weight of what had already been said. Daniel's gaze had been fixed on the fire for so long that the host began to wonder if he had drifted into his own thoughts entirely, but then Daniel spoke, his voice careful, each word deliberate. He said he hadn't stumbled onto this cabin by accident. The host felt the shift immediately, the quiet turning sharper, more fragile. Daniel explained that he had been looking for something, or rather, someone, for a long time. His journey had not been random hikes or aimless wandering, but a deliberate path that had led him here tonight. The words came slowly, as if dragging up something buried deep. He spoke of a night years ago, in a city alive with protest, where voices rose together in defiance of a world that refused to see them. There had been chaos, sirens blaring, the push and pull of a crowd caught between hope and fear, and in the middle of it, a moment of strange stillness. A man's hand in his, a shared glance that felt like the rest of the world had fallen away. He said that man had been kind, unexpectedly so in a night full of fear, and that kindness had left a mark he had never been able to forget. As Daniel's voice moved through the memory, the host felt something stir deep inside him, a recognition that began as a faint ache and quickly grew sharper. He didn't need Daniel to say more to know where this was going. The details matched too perfectly, the press of the crowd, the glint of streetlights on wet pavement, the fleeting safety in a stranger's touch. It had been so long that he had convinced himself the other man would have forgotten him entirely, that he was just a passing moment in someone else's life. But Daniel's eyes, steady and searching, told him otherwise. The room seemed to shrink, the space between them now a living thing that carried both the years they had lost and the ones that might still be waiting. The host didn't move, didn't breathe too deeply, afraid the moment might shatter if he did. Daniel's voice softened even further as he admitted he hadn't known the man's name that night, that all he had remembered was the feeling, the quiet steadiness of someone who had reached for him not out of pity, but out of recognition. He had searched without a map, without knowing what he would do if he found him, only that he had to try. The host could feel the truth pressing at the edges of his own restraint. He wanted to admit it, to tell Daniel that he remembered too, that he had carried that same brief, electric connection in the back of his mind all these years like a hidden ember that never fully cooled. But the words felt dangerous, too big to release into the air without knowing what they would change. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his eyes locked on Daniel's in a silent acknowledgement that needed no explanation. Daniel must have seen something in that look, because his expression shifted, some guarded layer peeling back to reveal a glimmer of relief, maybe even something like hope. The sound of the rain seemed to fade, the world narrowing to the warm glow of the room and the knowledge that they were not strangers after all. Neither of them said it outright, but in that moment, it didn't matter. The truth was there, heavy and undeniable, woven into the quiet between heartbeats. The fire had settled into a slow, steady burn, each log collapsing inward as the heat consumed it, sending the occasional sigh of sparks drifting up the chimney. Outside, the rain had softened into a misty drizzle, the steady tap of droplets against the roof now almost a lullaby. But inside, the air between them was anything but calm. It felt as though years of silence, years of not knowing, had condensed into this small cabin, filling every inch of the space. Neither of them had moved much since Daniel had spoken his truth. The host sat with his elbows resting on his knees, his hands loosely clasped, staring into the orange heart of the fire as though it might give him the right words. Daniel, across from him, leaned back in his chair but kept his eyes fixed in a way that was not casual, it was attentive, waiting, the look of someone who has offered a piece of themselves and is bracing for what comes next. When the host finally spoke, his voice was low, roughened not by the fire's smoke but by the memory that had been locked away for so long. He said he remembered that night too. He remembered the press of the crowd, the cold sting of rain mixing with the salt of sweat, the blur of sirens, the shouting that filled the streets. And in the middle of it, he remembered looking into the face of someone who seemed to anchor him, who reached for his hand without hesitation, who held it with a firmness that said, without words, that they would stand together no matter how quickly the world around them might fracture. He remembered how that connection lasted only minutes before the crowd surged, pulling them apart, and how afterward he had searched the faces around him, hoping for even a glimpse, but found nothing. He confessed that he had told himself to forget, because holding on to something so fleeting felt foolish, but that the truth was he had never fully let go of the image of that moment. Daniel's shoulders seemed to loosen at those words, his eyes softening, though his jaw still carried the tension of someone who had spent too long holding himself against disappointment. Slowly, they began piecing together what they each remembered, their voices weaving a shared recollection from fragments, details that one of them had missed, moments the other had clung to. They spoke about the way the air had felt that night, charged and electric, how the sound of chanting had rolled like a wave down the streets, how strangers had become allies in the blink of an eye. And as they spoke, the distance between their chairs seemed to shrink without either of them moving them closer, the invisible thread drawing tighter. There was a moment when their eyes met and stayed locked, and the host could feel the pull in his chest, the ache of having someone who had once been a ghost in his memory now sitting close enough that the faint scent of rain still clung to him. The firelight danced over Daniel's face, softening its edges, tracing the faint scar along his jaw that the host now recognized, that he realized he must have seen that night without even noticing. Time outside the cabin felt irrelevant. The rain could have stopped or gone on for days, it wouldn't have mattered. The cabin had become something else entirely, a cocoon, a quiet place where the past was not just remembered but made present again. Daniel's voice dropped even lower, almost as if he were afraid to break whatever fragile thing they were holding between them. He said he hadn't known what finding him would mean, whether it would be a brief hello or something deeper, but that being here, now, made him realize the years of searching had been worth it, even if tonight was the only night they would have. The host didn't respond right away. He simply let the words settle in the air, their weight both comforting and frightening. His hand moved almost without him realizing it, resting on the table between them, open, not reaching but waiting. Daniel's gaze dropped to it, and for a long heartbeat he didn't move. Then, as if drawn by something neither of them could resist, his hand came forward and covered it. The contact was warm, grounding, the kind of touch that speaks in a language older than words. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. In the soft glow of the fading fire, with the rain still whispering beyond the walls, they sat together, holding on as though the space between the past and the present had finally, impossibly, disappeared. The storm had left the world outside washed clean, the faint scent of wet pine drifting through the cracks of the cabin walls. The fire was little more than a cradle of glowing embers now, their heat still reaching out in soft waves. Daniel's hand remained on his, neither of them breaking the connection, as though moving would undo everything they had just rebuilt. The silence between them was no longer heavy with uncertainty. It was something else now, fuller, almost tender, carrying a depth that words might only cheapen. The host could feel the rhythm of Daniel's pulse beneath his palm, steady but not calm, and it struck him how rare it was to sit so close to someone and not feel the need to fill the space with noise. Outside, the drizzle had stopped altogether, leaving only the occasional drip of water from the roof into the wet earth below. It should have been the kind of quiet that lulls a person toward sleep, but instead it made every sensation sharper, more alive. Daniel shifted slightly in his seat, his thumb brushing lightly over the back of the host's hand in an unconscious motion that sent a subtle shiver up his arm. His gaze searched the host's face, lingering a little too long on his eyes, then dropping to his mouth before quickly flicking back upward. It was the kind of look that carried both a question and an answer at once. When Daniel spoke, his voice was low, almost hesitant, but certain in its intent. He said he had spent years imagining this moment, not the exact cabin, not the sound of rain easing into stillness, but the feeling of finding him again, of knowing without doubt that it was real. He admitted that in all those imagined moments, he had never been sure whether the other man would remember him, let alone feel the same spark that had kept him searching. Hearing this, the host felt a knot inside him loosen, a tension he hadn't even known he had been carrying all these years. He told Daniel he had remembered, though he had never let himself dwell on it, because it felt like holding on to something that might never come back. Yet now, with Daniel sitting here, so close, the years between them felt like pages in a book they could finally read together. Daniel's eyes softened in a way that made the host's chest tighten, and then he leaned forward just slightly, enough that the warmth of his breath became a part of the air they shared. The host didn't move back. He let the moment stretch, suspended and fragile, before closing the last bit of space between them. The first touch of lips was gentle, tentative, but it carried the weight of everything they hadn't said, years of wondering, of imagining, of not knowing. It was the kind of kiss that felt like an answer. When they parted, neither of them rushed to speak. Their foreheads rested together for a few long breaths, the quiet wrapping around them like another layer of warmth. Eventually, Daniel pulled back just enough to meet his eyes again, and there was something in his expression, gratitude, relief, and maybe a little fear of what came next. The host reached up and brushed a damp strand of hair from Daniel's forehead, his fingers lingering for a moment longer than necessary. He told him that whatever tomorrow might bring, tonight was theirs. Daniel's lips curved into the faintest smile, but it was the kind that held its own ache, as if he, too, was aware of how fleeting moments like this could be. The fire gave a final soft crackle, and Daniel glanced toward it as if waking from a trance, then back to him. There was still so much to say, so much neither of them fully understood about what this night meant, but for now they let the quiet hold them. They sat like that for what felt like hours, hands still joined, until the embers dimmed to a deep, steady glow, and the cabin settled around them as if it had been waiting years for this moment just as much as they had. Morning crept into the cabin slowly, pale light slipping through the thin curtains and settling over the worn wooden floorboards. The air was cool, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and the faint, lingering smoke from the fire that had finally burned itself out sometime during the night. The host stirred first, not because of the light but because of the quiet sound of steady breathing close by. Daniel was still asleep, his head tilted slightly toward the arm of the couch, one hand resting loosely against his chest. In the softness of sleep, the years seemed to fall away from his face, leaving only the faint lines of someone who had fought hard to be here, in this moment. For a long while, the host simply watched him, afraid that moving would break the fragile peace that had settled between them. The events of the night before felt both impossibly vivid and dreamlike, as though they existed in a space outside of ordinary time. The cabin, the storm, the fire, they had been a backdrop for something neither of them could have planned, something that had quietly shifted the course of their lives. Eventually, Daniel's eyes opened, still hazy with sleep, and a slow smile formed when he saw the host watching him. No words were needed at first, the look they shared carried the unspoken understanding that whatever this was, it mattered. The host moved to make coffee, the simple act grounding them back into the reality of morning. The smell filled the small space, mixing with the crisp scent of the outdoors, and Daniel joined him at the table, wrapping his hands around the warm mug without drinking right away. They spoke in low voices, their words weaving between long pauses, neither of them wanting to rush the moment but both aware that the day would not wait for them. Daniel admitted he had no plan beyond finding him, that he didn't know what came next, whether this was a beginning or a brief chapter before life pulled them in different directions again. The host confessed he didn't have those answers either, but that for the first time in years, he didn't feel the need to have them. Outside, the sky was beginning to clear, streaks of pale blue cutting through the fading mist. The world beyond the cabin was waking up, but inside, time still felt suspended. They finished their coffee in companionable quiet, and when it came time for Daniel to leave, neither of them moved quickly. Standing by the door, they lingered in the kind of goodbye that is both heavy and strangely light, holding each other just long enough to make it clear that this wasn't the end. Daniel stepped outside first, the sound of his boots on the wet ground sharp in the morning air, and the host followed him to the edge of the clearing. The forest stood silent around them, the lake in the distance glinting faintly under the first touch of sunlight. They didn't make promises, because promises would have felt too fragile under the weight of the unknown. Instead, they exchanged a look, steady, sure, and quietly fierce, that said what words couldn't. Then Daniel turned and began the walk down the narrow trail, his figure slowly blending into the trees until he was gone. The host stood there a moment longer, listening to the forest, to the faint lap of water against the shore, to the echo of footsteps fading into memory. When he finally went back inside, the cabin felt different, as though the night had left something behind, a quiet trace of warmth that the morning couldn't wash away. He knew the world outside would return with its noise and demands, that days would pass and life would pull them into whatever came next. But he also knew that one night, one storm, one knock on the door, one unexpected return, had shifted something inside him forever. And whether or not their paths crossed again, that change would remain, like the lingering scent of rain in the air, impossible to ignore. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more emotional LGBTQ love stories. Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever had a moment that changed your life forever? Your engagement helps us bring more powerful stories to life, so hit that notification bell to never miss the next one.